I read the Washington Post editorial the other day, and I was extremely disappointed that they chose to talk about ideology and all this other stuff, and this is about human safety. There's no ideology in this decision. This is a decision about what is the right thing to do for people in our community, actually for people in any community. We just happen to be willing to act first. This council has ventured into areas like this before. We did coal tar. We did extraordinary things in 10 Mile Creek. We banned trans fats. We required menu labeling. We did a whole bunch of things. And in every single case, people said, you know, the science isn't all there. You know, there's divided opinion on this. You're moving ahead in places where, you know, the government says it's okay to do this. And we said, well, maybe the government says it's okay to do this, but maybe we shouldn't be doing it. Maybe we shouldn't allow it. But I want to try to lay out as much as I can of what there is, I think, in a scientific case for this. And I will acknowledge also that the Post makes an interesting observation that there are conflicting scientific studies, and then says you shouldn't do anything because there are conflicting scientific studies. And I suggest if we were in a room with 6 people and 3 people said, if you drink this, it's poison, and I'm certain of that, and 3 people said, oh, no harm at all, any of us would think really hard before we drank whatever was in front of us in the face of conflicting stories. And I would probably opt not to drink it rather than to try to prove a point, not particularly since I wouldn't know what point I was proving until it was too late, possibly. So this is where I come out on this issue and why I come out here. Many have raised the point that if pesticides are harmful, then state and federal regulators would have acted. And unfortunately, that is not true. That is not the only example of where we in the county have acted as legislators. The Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, FIFRA, much better name, requires registration with the EPA of most pesticides. This registration does not guarantee that pesticides are safe. And if you read the labels, you know that pesticides are safe. Many of them are very clear, only safe if used in a particular way, not generically safe, not like you should be taking teaspoons of it and eating it. In fact, the EPA is directed to balance risk with benefit of each pesticide, and they usually rely on analysis submitted by pesticide manufacturers, not independent analysis by the EPA, but by manufacturers that have long-term relationships with companies that do the testing for them to assess the effects of the pesticides. Now, and this is occurring in a bigger context. There are businesses all over the country that are raising concerns about the validity of what's allowed in our food and in our atmosphere and in our water. There's now recognition that even if federal government allows chemicals to be used, that it does not mean that they are safe. And I want to quote from an article that talks about 2 of my favorite companies, Target and Walmart. And it says, Target has expanded the list of chemicals it wants suppliers to take out of their products, all legal chemicals, stepping up pressure on its vendors to respond to consumer health concerns. The list includes almost 600 substances on Health Canada's roster of prohibited cosmetic ingredients, including such as tolsarum, coal tars, and BPA. It also adds triclosan, an antibacterial ingredient that is under review in hand soaps. And let's see, and it was banned in Target's home state last year. Walmart began demanding greener products from suppliers in 2009, said Brian Sansoni, a spokesman for American Cleaning Institute. That process intensified 2 years ago when Walmart said it would require manufacturers to phase out 10 undisclosed substances. Like Target, Walmart maintains a list of more than 1,000 chemicals it wants suppliers to curb their use. So we're not even talking about just us. This is a much broader concern. Then there's the issue of low-level exposure, and a lot of this is made of what's carcinogenic and what's not carcinogenic. There are many, many sublethal effects that don't have anything to do with cancer, don't have anything to do with causing heart attacks. And there's a project being undertaken called the Halifax Projects. It includes 300 scientists from research institutions in 31 countries. One team investigated low-dose exposure to everyday chemicals and their role in cancer development. The research published in the scientific journal Carcinogenesis shows that many common and widespread chemicals can affect cancer-related mechanisms in the body at low doses people typically encounter in the environment. Although these chemicals are not known to cause cancer on their own, the report presents the novel idea that they can combine in ways that have synergistic carcinogenic effects. The findings suggest that it may be time for a fundamental change in the way we think about chemical carcinogens. And I'm quoting here, cancer does not develop all at once. It happens through a series of mutations and genetic changes that collectively transform normal cells into aggressive cancer cells, the multiple hits model. Many chemicals can interfere with individual cancer-related processes, are not complete carcinogens, but exposure to combinations of these substances can interfere with multiple cancer-related processes, overwhelming the body's defenses and mechanisms and result in cancer. An April 2010 report from the President's Cancer Panel also noted that existing regulations and the exposure assessment on which they are based are outdated in most cases. Many known or suspected carcinogens are completely unregulated. This is the President's Cancer Panel. Enforcement of most existing regulations is poor. In virtually all cases, regulation fails to take into account multiple exposures and exposure interactions. Industry has exploited regulatory weakness, such as government's reactionary rather than precautionary approach to regulation. Antibiotic resistance is another area of concern. Pesticides linked to antibiotic resistance include dicamba 2,4-D and glyphosate. And this is from a study of sublethal effects, and it says what makes our study different is that it is looking at sublethal effects, said the study's lead author, Jack Heinemann, professor of genetics at the University of Canterbury, New Zealand. It's the lethal toxicity that people focus on in other studies, he explained. He explains that because their herbicides are not super toxic to bacteria they studied, E. coli and Salmonella, they are not killed outright at levels typically used to kill weeds. Instead, the bacteria stay alive while activating proteins known as efflux pumps, which dumps the stuff out of a cell in order to rid themselves of toxins. And this defense mechanism can make the bacteria develop resistance to the threat from which it is defending itself. This is very carefully designed study, said Michael Hansen, a senior staff scientist at Consumers Union. It's incredibly important work showing the complexity of an effect that hadn't been thought of before. The mechanisms by which bacteria respond to toxins in this case are well known. What's new and important is looking at non-lethal effects of exposure in combination with antibiotics. And this is a big deal because people rely on studies that were done sometimes 15 years ago or longer. And our knowledge of the human body and our knowledge of what occurs inside the cells and how our cells react and how our gut reacts is a far cry from what it was 15 years ago. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when I was told that there was this thing called the mitochondria inside the human cell, and the mitochondria was the energy center of the cell, and that's all we knew about it. And there's obviously a ton more going on inside the mitochondria, but the state of science at that point was, we don't know what's happening here. Just trust us. It's the energy center. Well, how many years am I past high school now? Several decades after high school. This is actually a known organism, and it's an understood organism. Well, if you had done tests when something wasn't understood, you're going to get way different, potentially, results than when you understand systems better. And our state of science and our state of knowledge does not reflect our current state of knowledge of the human body. And to rely on tests that were based on, I think, an earlier standard is not valid. Now, there's much been made about the EPA. And I want to say, because I have friends in the EPA, that I know a lot of really honorable people who want to do the right thing. I'll also say that I'm relatively assured that political influence is not something that's not heard of inside of U.S. government regulatory agencies. And many of us thought that would change when the Bushes went away, but there are people who tell you that hasn't altogether changed despite that. I don't believe you can rely on the EPA to protect us. And this is an interesting hearing. And this is the case I'm going to cite. It's the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit Court. It's a bunch of B people suing the U.S. EPA. And this verdict came down, was filed September 10th, 2015. So according to the court, the EPA had not followed their own guidelines. They had looked at the studies, said the studies were inadequate, gave them a conditional approval, said come back. They never brought back any additional evidence. There were no more studies submitted. That's what the ruling says. And the EPA went ahead and gave them a further approval. And the judges say, and you can read this is online, it says there's no connection between the facts in the case and the EPA decision. The judges who opine collectively and in their individual opinions say you cannot go from the facts that the EPA submitted to the decision that the EPA made. That's pretty serious. They even talked about what a low bar this was. They didn't just fail the evidence, they failed to cross the arbitrary and capricious bar. These judges were very concerned with this, and I invite people to read this because this is probably not the only time the EPA has not followed its own regulations. It says the EPA may grant the conditional registration of a pesticide even though some of the requirements may not have been submitted or reviewed. There's no specified time period for when data must be submitted or reviewed. Numerous pesticides are on the market for years under conditional registration. The government, the GAO, documented that the EPA did not effectively track these conditional registrations. And an investigation by the Natural Resources Defense Council documented that 65% of the pesticides on the market were conditional registration. Their findings were confirmed by the EPA. In the case of sulfoxaflor, whatever it is, it's a neonicotinoid. The EPA changed its conditional registration to an unconditional approval without receiving the additional information that the EPA said itself was needed. There's another one, weed killer in drinking water, and some of my colleagues know about atrazine. At least it's come up before at the state level as well. It's a popular weed killer. The EPA says you're not exposed to unsafe levels, but new research suggests that atrazine may be dangerous at lower concentrations than previously thought. Recent studies suggest that even at concentrations meeting current federal standards, the chemical may be associated with birth defects, low birth weights, and menstrual problems. Some scientists and health advocates disagree. They argue that the recent studies offer concerns that the government should begin re-examining the regulations. The EPA has not cautioned pregnant women about the potential risks of atrazine, so they can consider using inexpensive home filtration systems. And though the agency is aware of new research suggesting risks, it will not formally review those studies until next year at the earliest. And atrazine is serious, and it falls into this category of things that have endocrine disrupting effects. And one of the differences they talk about between things that are endocrine disruptors and poisons is that poisons are usually linked to reducing toxicity as you lower the levels of the poison. What they're finding with endocrine disruptors is that you can lower the exposure, it doesn't necessarily lower the effect. And again, this is one of the new areas of science which has not been very well explored and certainly wasn't very well studied, and it ought to be enough to give people pause. The health risks for pesticides are numerous. Expecting the children have a unique window of vulnerability. They're at much greater risk from chemical exposure than you and I are, assuming there are only a couple of kids in the audience. Children's vulnerability to chemical pesticides is further magnified by the rapid growth and development of their nervous systems and other bodily organs, as well as by their immature detoxification mechanisms, which makes it very difficult for infants to break down and excrete pesticides after they've been exposed. These factors place infants and children at increased risk for harmful effects of pesticide exposure, which may be permanent and irreversible. And that's from a letter to the Montgomery County Council from Dr. Phil Landrigan, chairman of Department of Preventive Medicine, professor of pediatrics, dean for Global Health Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. Again, this is an actual doctor who does real research. Active ingredients in the ubiquitous Roundup is a probable carcinogen, and that's according to IARC, and I think the California EPA just made the same ruling within the last week or two. Glyphosate, the active ingredient in Monsanto's Roundup, is a group 2 probable based on sufficient evidence of carcinogenity in laboratory animals, and there's been an issue raised about, it's not said to be an absolute causer of cancer. And then, one of the responses from the scientific community is it would be unethical to do the kind of dose trials with glyphosate that you do with other industrial chemicals, where you have a known setting in an industry and you can measure what's out in the factory every day. That's one thing, but it's very difficult to get dose-relevant data on a population which moves around and is exposed to different chemicals at different times and in different places. But we'll see what happens with what happens with Roundup in the near future. Anyway, when I get to what I think is probably, there's a ton of scientific stuff here, and I'm going to make everything I've put here out, make it available to people so that at least they can see, as the Washington Post suggested, there are a few conflicting studies out here. But I want to talk, I guess, why I wind up and why I wind up there. We all know about DDT, and it was banned not because of human health concerns. It was banned because it weakened the eggs of raptors. And among the raptors was the eagle, and we all knew we didn't want to be responsible for killing off the national bird, so the government acted to ban DDT, primarily for environmental reasons. So then there was a study, and there was a meta-analysis that looked at women who were exposed to DDT, and they concluded that it was hard to show that DDT was a carcinogen. Then there was another study, and the other study was a longitudinal study by the Kaiser Foundation of 50, I think what's the number? 54-year study. Thousands of women who were known to be exposed to DDT and who got pregnant. And this is the significant difference. What they found was high rates of breast cancer in the children of the mothers who were exposed to DDT while the mothers were pregnant. Not cancer in the mothers, cancer in the children of mothers. So if this is the kind of science that you need to prove a link between a chemical and a problem, do we want to wait 54 years for a longitudinal study to come back and say, well, you know, the people who applied it didn't die? Unfortunately, their kids had higher rates, and if only we had known back then, maybe we would have done something. I don't want anybody sitting where we sit now or anyplace else 50 years down the road saying, you know, if we had done something back then, we could have saved so many cancer cases or these many birth defects or any number of other things. There's no reason to do that. What we're talking about here is some clover in a lawn and possible risks to human beings. I say possible. I'm not saying that every chemical is an absolute risk, but I have absolute certainty that some of these things are a risk, and some of these things are applied in ways that put people at risk. And I think we have an obligation to act. I think we have an obligation to act in some ways greater than on some of the other issues we've acted on. I mean, there's nothing, I think, that's more important than the health of our children. We need to be aware of what exposure may cause. And I think we have a responsibility to err on the side of maximum protection. We are not messing with agriculture. There's nothing in this bill that changes the way agriculture will be conducted in this county. And contrary to what people may think, I'm not intending on offering version 2.0 of this bill that does that. That is not going to happen. And this bill is not a ban. This bill has enough, I would call loopholes to be the wrong words, but there are conditions in which ordinary exceptions, thank you. There are conditions under which other regulated pesticides can be applied. You don't have to jump through hoops. It's not an impossible bar that's been established by the bill, so I think there are alternatives that are made available to people. And lastly, we don't actually have an AG's opinion. I've spoken to the AG. He said what was written is not an AG's opinion. It would not be considered an AG's opinion by a court. So I'm relatively comfortable with where we are. I do think that Roger's description of this as a balanced and prudent bill applies to either version of it. I don't think that the other version is terrible. I just think that we have the ability to go farther. I think we have the responsibility to go farther. And I'm happy to be one of those votes that's going to try to move this a little bit farther.